All right, so real quick on continuing talking about writing lab reports for science. So we already talked about how really we break a lab report into kind of four specific paragraphs. First paragraph is really just a summary of the questions and the hypothesis. So this is like the problem that was being asked and the hypothesis that was being presented. Then the next paragraph is really about the methods of the procedure in which that hypothesis is being tested. Your third paragraph is really where you're going to talk about your results, actual specific collected data, and what that data means. So this is where you're going to communicate an understanding to your reader. And then lastly is kind of a conclusion, a wrap up. And this is where you're going to say what the actual answer to the problem was, whether your hypothesis was supported or not, maybe some further research that should be done. If there was some sort of like provided scenario that's been discussed, you can make a connection to that here as well. So this is kind of the starting point of how we talk or how we write lab reports in a science environment so that we are communicating everything clearly to our reader. Remember, we kind of want to write as though our readers are idiots, as though they are dumb and they're not going to understand anything. We don't want them to have to come up with any real thought on their own. We want to tell the reader what it is that they need to think. Because if they have to come up with an idea on their own, we should assume that the idea they come up with is going to be wrong. So in talking about this, we're going to discuss the lab report, same as the lab report example we used for our last lesson. And this was the lab report from the Plot Plot Phys Phys lab that we did way back kind of in the beginning of the year. And in that lab, just as a reminder about it, we took water at different temperatures. Some water that was cold had been refrigerated, some room temperature water, kind of fresh out of the tap, and some warmer water. And we dropped Alka-Seltzer tablets in to see how long it took for those Alka-Seltzer tablets to stop fizzing. And then we looked at that data. So that's the lab I'm gonna talk about, and I'm gonna focus very specifically on the third paragraph here for this lesson. It's just the data analysis. When we talk about data analysis, there's really three things to keep in mind. The first part is we should be telling the reader what the data actually means. That's really what the third paragraph is about. It's also important that we tell the reader how that data relates to the hypothesis. That really kind of shows up in your fourth paragraph where you're saying whether your hypothesis is supported or not and why. This is kind of the and why part of that. And then you also may end up needing to really explain to the reader why this data matters. Like, why is it relevant to the problem that was being addressed? Sometimes you're going to have data that's not really relevant to the problem that was being addressed. Or sometimes you have data there was a problem in the data collection, and that data needs to be excluded. And this is also where you might want to say that. But in looking at the third paragraph, this is what we really see. It really breaks down simply into a couple parts for that third paragraph. First, we say what our independent variable was and what our dependent variable was. In the case of the Plot Plot Phys Phys lab, our independent variable was the temperature of water. That's what we were in control of. The dependent variable was the amount of time it took for the Alka-Seltzer tablet to stop fizzing. That's what we were measuring in the end. Then we're going to state what our relationship was. In this particular experiment, there was an inverse relationship between that IV, the temperature of the water, and the dV, the amount of time it took for the Alka-Seltzer tablet to stop fizzing. And then we need to provide data that is evidence of that relationship that we just talked about. So in this case, I say temperature of the water at its lowest point, 10 degrees Celsius, required to most times 76 degrees Celsius. Then when the temperature of the water rose to 20 degrees Celsius, the time fell to 41 degrees Celsius. At that point, I've given two data points, which is the bare minimum necessary in order to show a relationship. I also add in a third data point here because more data is better. So I showed that pattern continued when the temperature continued to rise up to 50 degrees Celsius, that the amount of time required continued to drop down to 21 degrees Celsius. Now, this is a really simple set of data analysis because there was only one relationship. Through the entirety of the experiment, there was only one relationship, and it was always inverse. Sometimes in an experiment, you don't just have one relationship, though. Sometimes there's a clear point where the relationship changes, and we actually see that in the hydrogen lab. Especially when you look at your first set of data, graph one. You see that there is one relationship in the first three data points. So the trial 1 to 2 and then up to trial 3, there's one particular relationship. And then if you look at between trials 3, 4, and 5, there's a totally different relationship. So at that point, like in that data analysis, we would want to say the relationship is inverse direct or none at this point, and here's why, and provide data. And then we would say, but here the relationship is whatever the new relationship is, and then provide data for that. So sometimes that will happen in more complicated labs, like in our hydrogen lab. All right, so that's the lesson. If you have any questions, make sure you see me.